What's up, guys? So today I'm going to be talking about the problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, what spurred this on is this specific Reddit thread. I've had an opinion about what the problem is with Yu-Gi-Oh!, but this I would say is a guy talking about something that I think is a symptom. Now, I don't agree with everything he says, but I get his general point. But I think that this is a symptom, which is essentially loads of hand traps in the deck and decks with really small compact engines. This is a symptom of a greater problem in Yu-Gi-Oh! And yeah, I'll go into it. It's going to be a two-part video as well, so I think there are two main issues. And just to give you it right at the beginning so that you don't have to waste your time, the first problem I think is there are too many generic boss monsters. The second problem I think is that there are too many easily splashable engines. I think those are the main two issues with Yu-Gi-Oh! So, this guy says, hand traps are not the problem. It's the difference in access to hand traps which is the problem. Some decks can only run a few hand traps, like 3 to 6, when others can play 22 free spots without losing consistency. Because of this, it's always the same decks that are advantaged, new meta decks, and a few decks favoured by Konami with small engines. The fact that always the same decks can both be relatively resistant against hand traps and run an insane amount of hand traps is by definition super unfair. To fix this, Konami should only release archetypes that can play roughly the same amount of hand traps, or release support for other decks so they can afford to play as many hand traps without losing consistency. It would make the whole format more enjoyable and less cancerous. It would also add some diversity, which should be welcome. So yeah, like I said, I don't actually agree with a lot of individual things, which I'll quickly run through. Now the first thing is, the first point, that's main, his general opinion, which is it's the difference in access to hand traps which is the problem. I don't think this is the problem. I think it seems like an issue sometimes, but it's more of a symptom of a greater issue, like I said, which is generic boss monsters. Now, when he says some decks can only run a few, like whereas others can play 22 free spots without losing consistency, this isn't true. This is hyperbole. This occasionally happens. Like right now, for example, the kind of 60 card pile Dragon Link deck, for example, they kind of can. They can play a lot of hand traps, but in general, most decks are playing between 6 and 14 hand traps. It's rare that you see a deck just able to splash that many in unless it's post-siding. So it's not true. Now, I do agree with the notion that the same decks seem to be on top. The format does occasionally feel like it gets stale. But again, I think that's a symptom of generic engines and stuff, and I'll go into why I think that's created an issue. Now, I also don't agree with this at all, that it's always the same decks that can be resistant and run an insane amount of hand traps. That's not true. And I'll point to Prank Kids, for example. Prank Kids is a deck that can play so many hand traps. Last format, I would say they could occasionally play up to like 18 hand traps. However, Prank Kids is also very susceptible to hand trap. They lose to Ash on their first normal summon. They lose to Nibiru. They lose to Bell on 2 or 3 different cards. It's not as simple as you run 15 hand traps in Prank Kids and nothing stops you. It's rare for a deck to be completely resistant against hand traps. That's actually quite rare. Most of the time, even if a deck can run a lot of hand traps, it's still going to be hurt by hand traps. Funnily enough, the decks that tend to be kind of very resilient against hand traps tend to be decks that can't run hand traps at all. Actually, it tends to be decks that are like all gas no breaks. They run like the current Brave engine that, for example, Tatsium topped with. He don't run any hand traps at all. He just run lots of gas. They tend to be the decks that don't care about hand traps because everything in the deck is an extender. Now, next he goes, to fix this, Konami should only release archetypes that can play roughly the same amount of hand traps, or release support for other decks so they can afford to play as many hand traps without losing consistency. I don't agree with this either. I think making everything the same is not fun. Part of the enjoyment of any game is diversity, but even a difference in power level is good for game health. You don't want every deck to be exactly the same power level. It's fun to have some decks that are slightly worse, some decks that are slightly better, and it's a natural thing that will happen as well. It's just the progression of any meta of any game. So I don't agree with the fact. I don't think Konami should do it, even if they could, but I don't think it's possible for them to do it. Yeah, so that's his point. So this is why I think that generic boss monsters are the problem. And actually, funny enough, this guy says, maybe does he say it? Well, no, he doesn't. But anyway, yeah. This is why I think generic boss monsters are more of an issue. Now, traditionally in Yu-Gi-Oh, it was more archetypal. Now, actually, I say this, but it's not actually traditionally in Yu-Gi-Oh. Traditionally in Yu-Gi-Oh, it was just good stuff.deck. But I would say from about 2000 and maybe 2010 onwards, Yu-Gi-Oh started to become very archetypal, which is you would have a set of cards which would all have a matching name or a matching theme, so like Light Swarms or Dark Worlds or Dragons. It's like you would have a set of cards that all kind of match a theme, and then they would all kind of work towards a strategy together, and you can put these cards together. You can splash in other cards from other decks, but most of your support, most of the cards in your deck are going to be geared towards supporting everything in your archetype. I actually think this is really positive for Yu-Gi-Oh! It made it have an identity almost. When you have a deck, well, not Yu-Gi-Oh! It made your deck have almost an identity. So I'm playing a Light Swarm deck, and my focus is milling cards to eventually bring out this big bomb. And I think that's quite cool, because it also means that because of the sheer amount of decks in Yu-Gi-Oh!, I can play whatever I want to do. There's different strategies. There's lots of different ways to play a mill deck. There's lots of different ways to play a deck focused on OTKing. There's lots of different ways to play a deck focused on comboing. And that's another thing. Archetypes tended, this isn't always true, but they tended to have focus towards a specific game plan. There was a point where we would have words like combo deck, stun deck, mill deck. Like this was a thing before. Nowadays, those archetypes don't really apply. Every deck is a combo deck for the most part. Every deck has some sort of combo that they can do that will eventually lead to a crazy board. Every deck has some sort of aspect of stun where they just lock their opponent out of the game. Every deck has some sort of aspect of control where they're focusing on resource management. But back in the day, that wasn't the case, and it was better. Now, I would say the real kind of flipping point for this was two things, where generic boss monsters started to become, or generic monsters started to become an issue. And I'd say the first stage, I'd say really where it was like, oh no, was XYZ format. Before this, for example, while there might be kind of staples like in synchro format and stuff, the commitment you needed to make a monster for utility, especially in your extra deck, was quite high. You would need a tuner, which was usually quite specific, and then a certain level. So if I want to make Stardust Dragon, while Stardust Dragon was very popular, it required quite a bit of commitment unless you were cheating it out with Starlight Road or whatever. But we move on later in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'd say XYZ Monsters was first where it was like generic utility, and this is outside of limited cards like Raigeki and stuff like that. But XYZ was the first time where generic utility was just easily available. You could have a generic boss monster that just wins. Good example, Shockmaster. I don't know what archetype Shockmaster is supposed to be part of, but it just wins. If you get 3 level 4 monsters on the field, you win. Azathoth was another one. And then it's not just that, but also generic utility in the forms of things like Castel, the Sky Blaster Musketeer. What's another good example? Abyss Dweller. Generic utility. So decks, for example, that traditionally couldn't out a monster by shuffling it into the deck, suddenly have access to Castel. Decks that traditionally can't lock off the graveyard suddenly have it with Dweller. Decks that that don't normally lock you out of monsters suddenly have access to Shockmaster. And the reason why this is a problem is because it removes weaknesses from decks. It means that now it doesn't really matter if I'm playing, because if I'm playing Dragons, for example, before my focus was put big attack monsters on the board, spam the board with big attack monsters. That's what Dragons could do. However, for example, if I come up against a control deck, it's a bit harder. I don't necessarily have the removal to deal with back row or to deal with generic cards on the board. But now, for example, as I play Dragons, I can summon Hieratic Sunlord or the Overlord or Hieratic Sunlord or Heliopolis or whatever it's called, and I can pop cards when I couldn't before. And having this extra deck utility in the form of boss monsters that you don't normally have, this almost removes the power ceiling for most decks. Now, in the XYZ format, an advantage of it is at the very least, it was like you need to be able to get 2 monsters of a certain level. So the rank 4 pool, for example, was always a bit unbalanced. It was always a bit strong. But for example, you didn't have access to the rank 7 pool, which had some incredibly busted monsters. When a deck finally did get access to it, Dragon Rulers, it was insane. But in general, if you couldn't get those levels, you weren't doing it. And so this is where Link Monsters come in. And I think this is where Link Monsters really, really ruined it, and they took it far. Link Monsters, when they first came out, were actually crap. But they were very generic, and a lot of people, even when Link Monsters came out, understood how they were going to be a problem in the future. Because even though we only had stuff like Mrs. Radiant, I think Link Spider might have actually been one of the early ones as well, I don't really remember. But yeah, like so let's say Mrs. Radiant and Link Spider. Just the fact that you need 2 monsters, it doesn't really matter. In fact, in the early days of Link Monsters, they could even be tokens. A lot of Link Monsters, early Link Monsters, could even be tokens to make them. So all you need is 2 monsters of anything. As long as you can spam the board, you have access to this thing in your extra deck. People identified how that could be an issue. And it wasn't until we started seeing Link Monsters getting stronger and stronger and stronger that we really saw the problem with it. So, for example, the Nightmares. Nightmare Goblin. This card was insane because as soon as you get 2 monsters with different names on the board, which a lot of decks can do, you get an additional normal summon. Yeah. Nightmare Mermaid gave you full Walker's combo as soon as you got 2 monsters with different names on the board. Yeah, and these are issues, and these aren't even boss monsters. But now we start to talk about boss monsters, and I think the real beginning of the end, or the real kind of where it became really ridiculous, was the Borrow Dragons. I would say that's the first time where I really thought this is ridiculous. Now, Borrowload was a problem, I would say. Borrowload doesn't seem OP now, but when Borrowload came out, it was a really good card, because suddenly, for example, if I'm playing, now, guys, bear with me for my examples, I might be a little bit off in terms of the decks I'm saying, but just understand the point that I'm making. So, if I'm playing strikers, traditionally, it might be hard for me to out a certain type of monster that has high attack or that can't be targeted or whatever. Suddenly, though, with the release of a card like Borrowload Dragon, it doesn't matter what I'm playing, as long as I can accrue enough advantage to put 3 link monsters of the link rating of 4 on the board. I can now out anything with Borrowload Dragon. Yeah. Now, Borrowload Dragon didn't immediately kind of seem as much of a threat or as a problem with boss monsters, because at that time it's like, you take the monster, but at least the game's not over. But I'd say this kind of got even worse with Borrow Sword Dragon. I'd say Borrow Sword Dragon really changed the landscape of Yu-Gi-Oh! Completely, because now, as long as I can get Borrow Sword plus another monster on board, as long as I can get that little bit of advantage, I'm going to kill you if your monster's right in attack. Yeah, before Borrow Sword Dragon, at least I remember, you didn't always really put your monsters in defense, like on defensive. Like, it wasn't that common, because if you just put your monsters in defense, most of the time they're going to get run over because monsters have low defense. So sometimes you'd normal summon a monster, or you'd leave it in attack, because even though you might take a little bit of chip damage, 300 or whatever, it's like it might be higher than whatever your opponent has. Well, Borrow Sword Dragon, you can't do that. If you dare to do that, do you know what's going to happen? Borrow Sword plus another monster, 8k, you die. Yeah, Borrow Sword Dragon allowed decks that couldn't traditionally end the game in 1 turn to end the game in 1 turn. And another reason why this is particularly important is because I would say that it changed the mindset of Yu-Gi-Oh! Now. You could die in a flash. You could die in 1 turn if you just lose control of the game. And so now you have to play a bit differently. And this is another thing that kind of further, because we had been gradually moving away, I would say, from turn 1 being super important. Like, we had been gradually moving away. Not completely. Turn 1 has always been stronger, but we were starting to move away. But I'd say Borrow Sword put it straight back. Because even though Borrow Sword is a turn 3 card, what it meant that is if on turn 1 I can get enough advantage and kind of lock you out of the game, I can just consolidate all these cards and kill you. Next turn, there's not a lot you can do about it. Yeah. Now, Borrow Sword was a big issue. But at least with Borrow Sword, like I said, it's turn 3. So for example, if I can kind of stop you with hand traps and stuff, and this is why I say hand traps aren't necessarily an issue. Hand traps allow you to deny your opponent on turn 1 and give you a response. Otherwise, FTKs just win. Yeah. But the next kind of 2 cards that I'd really point out and say these are more problems are Borrowload Savage Dragon and Appaloosa. Now, Appaloosa and Borrowload Savage Dragon, if we look at them in a vacuum, just as cards themselves, I'm going to say that they're actually both quite well designed. I like the idea of Borrowload Dragon giving you negates with a link monster you attach to it. I like the idea that it's kind of like, it's using resources that we used before, but it's not too busted. If you get rid of the, if you get rid of the link material, it loses the attack, for example. I like that. I don't think that's bad. Appaloosa as well. I like the idea of like, it doesn't do anything against spells and traps, it only does something against monsters. I like it. I like it that if you remove all the attack, it loses all the negates. But similarly, if you can do some crazy combos, like Ravenous Tarantula, for example, you can give it more negates. I like that. But the problem with these cards is this. Going first was really strong. Now before, I had access to my extra deck to kill you even when I couldn't kill you. So even if I'm playing Sky Striker now, and actually, sorry, just a quick tangent. Another big problem with decks being able to OTK you that couldn't OTK you before is that certain decks like Despots, for example, whose entire identity is being able to put big damage to the board, they become completely unviable. They become irrelevant. The only OTK deck, 2 OTK decks that are still semi-relevant in my opinion, are Cyber Dragons and Grim Marju. Every other OTK deck that is focused on doing big numbers, it's completely irrelevant because every deck can kill you in 1 turn, so you're not doing anything special. But anyway, yeah, the problem with Appaloosa and Borrowload Savage Dragon is that now, again, as long as I can get a bit of advantage on my turn 1, I get 3 negates. I get a free win almost, because I can put Borrowload Savage Dragon, which just says Omni Negate. Yeah, and Omni Negates is going to be another discussion I have soon as well. But yeah, as long as I can get enough materials to put Savage Dragon on the board, which is so generic. And the thing is, before, getting an 8 synchro was a little bit of effort. Now, getting a level 8 synchro is weak It's so easy for every deck in the game, especially with cards like Fibrax, for example. Getting 4 materials, 4 monsters with different names, or 4 materials on the board is so easy. And Appaloosa is even worse because Appaloosa started another trend of even more genericness, where it's like, you don't even need 4 monsters, 2 monsters. As long as you can get 2 monsters on the board, but the link rating is 4, you can make Appaloosa. Yeah, it's ridiculous because now, for example, as I'm playing my Dragon Link deck, for example, if I can get into Appaloosa first on turn 1 before you have a chance to even put a card on the board that's not a hand trap, I suddenly get a bunch of negates. I can suddenly stop you from playing the game. Yeah. And that's again a big issue. This is why I would say generic boss monsters are a problem, because traditionally that's not something that dragons could do. If they wanted to go into negate that early, they had to go to certain routes. But now, for example, if dragons only had access to Savage Dragon and maybe Hot Red, for example, as like their only like negates, I would say that's fine because they have to do certain routes, but they don't. They have Appaloosa, for example, as well. Now, obviously, they're not doing it right now. I'm thinking more about Danger Dragon Link, Danger Chaos Thunder Dragon back in 2017 or whatever is more of what I'm thinking. But I think the point still stands. Yeah, these boss monsters, again, I'd say these generic boss monsters were a big issue. And then I'd say we kind of get to the culmination, and in my opinion, one of the worst, this card I'd say is one of the worst designed cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think it's absolutely ridiculous, absolutely unfair, and it really, really homogenizes deck building. Because that's another problem with these generic boss monsters. What ends up happening is the best deck is just the deck that can make these cards the most efficiently. That's why Prank Kids was the best deck last format. Because you know what? Prank Kids, one normal summon, does all of this link spamming. And I'd say the worst card for this is Access Code Talker. I absolutely hate this card. I think this card is ridiculous for a lot of reasons. Firstly, like I said, it promotes greedy link climbing. And what I mean by that is, there are a lot of link monsters, for example, like Selene, Hauka Firex and stuff like that, that they as you link climb into them, it's almost, there should be almost like a waste. As I've gone to Hauka Firex, it should almost be like, I shouldn't be able to carry on link climbing after that. If I link climb, it should be almost hard. That's how I see it. That's what makes it fair, because Hauka Firex is summoning from the deck. It's already giving me an advantage. It shouldn't be, after I've made Hauka Firex, I can go into Unicorn and do more stuff with it. Similarly, another thing as well is that spamming summons should be punished. If I can summon 16, 15 times and just extend for days out of my extra deck, I should be punished, which is why I really like Nibiru. And so traditionally, you might not necessarily want to keep spamming summons because your opponent's going to nib you or something. Now it doesn't matter. In fact, you're encouraged to greedily link climb with access code. Do you know why? Because you're encouraged to go into this attribute, into this attribute, into this attribute, because access code gets to get more pops for it. And that's another thing. I don't think it makes sense that access code, for example, gets like 5300 attack, because you're probably going to go into link 3 to go into access code. And then after you've got into link 3, it's going to get another 3000 attack because of that. And then it gets pops, and the reason why I don't like his pops as well, now, not being able to respond to its summon, I'm okay-ish with that. I actually think that should be something that's more relevant on boss monsters. However, not being able to respond to its pops, and they don't target, I think that's really unfair. Because now, it puts all of the agency in the hands of the person with the access code talker. And you can say like, oh, if I'm ahead already, it's okay. But this is the thing, for example, Sky Striker traditionally might have a bit of problem killing you. Now, if they can hit you twice for Hayate, and then now access code can kill you. Yeah, now all they have to do is put an access code on the board. They get infinite pots from the grave. It's not a real cost because they're banishing stuff that's in the grave already. And they get to just pop cards in your field that they wouldn't traditionally be able to out easily. Yeah, that's an issue. And you can't respond, which means you have to just respond straight away. You have to do something. You have to basically have that out or you lose. And you know what? Some people will say that, yeah, it's just bringing the end of the game. Like, that you're already ahead. If you're making access code, you're already ahead. But you know what? I don't actually agree with that. Because, for example, normal summon effect Veiler plus another body is how they usually get into access code. So, as soon as they get into Hulk, they get into access code for free, which isn't good. I don't think every deck having generic access to a boss monster like that is good for the game, and I think it's healthy for the game, and I think that's what leads to a lot of these problems. Because now, as long as your deck can be compact and efficient, unless it has a really high ceiling already, as long as your deck can be compact and efficient to get into these really crazy boss monsters, you win. Now it doesn't matter if I spam the board with summons turn 1 especially, because now definitely, as long as I have access code in my extra deck, do you know what I do after I've used all the negates on the board? Make a big ass access code, pop your whole board, and I win. Yeah. There should be a punishment. As I've decided to commit to an Appaloosa and to a Borrowed Savage Dragon and to a whatever, the punishment should be afterwards. My deck is a bit exhausted almost. My deck has run through these negates and now just have these kind of spent monsters that still kind of put a bit of attack damage. But it's like I'm not just able to consolidate them into an even better monster that uses them again as material to kill you. And so this is why I say generic boss monsters are the problem. It removes identity from decks, and it simply makes it so that the best deck is the deck that can make these generic boss monsters. So how would I balance it? Well, in my opinion, I think the easiest way to balance it is just stop making generic boss monsters. If access code said something like, it had the same text as I think it's transcode of, you can only activate Cyberse monster effects or something like that, or you can only summon Cyberse monsters. If Borrowed Savage was only able to be made with dragon monsters. If Appaloosa, for example, if you have Appaloosa on the board, you can't use any other effects or something. I don't know, that might be a bit too harsh. I think making monsters less generic, adding more restrictions, especially to the creation, I think that would be the first way of balancing this. Yeah. So now if I want to make access code, I should play a Cyberse deck. This also, and I'll make a more specific video about these two decks, but Red Eyes Dark Dragoon and DP, this is the biggest issue of those decks. Red Eyes Dark Dragoon realistically should have made Dark Magician really, really good. Unfortunately, because any deck that can get 2 effect monsters can make it, Dark Magician didn't get any better. In fact, every other deck got way better than it. Because it's like, why would I ever play Dark Magician when I can just make it by making Verte? Similarly, DP. Hero should be the only deck that can use DP. If a hero guy polys for DP, I think that's fine. DP is a great card. If they're getting Celestial after that, that's fine, because Heroes has a lot of weaknesses. But the best deck with Heroes, the deck that can use Heroes that can use DP the best, again, and it's not only Sky Striker's a problem, by the way, there's other decks that are a problem. But again, the best deck that can use DP is Sky Striker. I don't think that's good for the game. I don't think that's healthy for the game. I don't think it's fair that if I'm a player who I've loved Heroes and I've wanted to play Heroes all my life, Heroes finally get support and I'm thinking, yes, I can be competitive. I don't think it's fair that Sky Striker gets to be more competitive with my boss monster. And then do you know what inevitably happens? Because Konami doesn't balance well, Konami eventually hits a random hero card. They hit Fusion Destiny or something. And now my deck's even weaker. Meanwhile, Sky Striker is still abusing it with Verte because it doesn't even matter. Yeah. So, funnily enough, those two cards will probably be so much less of an issue. For example, if Dragoon, for example, if Verte didn't exist, for example, Dragoon, and it's like now, for example, even though you can make Dragoon, I think if you make, even though Red Eyes Fusion, for example, I think is also a horribly designed card, but we'll talk about that another time. If you could only make Dragoon either by using Red Eyes Fusion or by using the kind of Tamias and all of that nonsense in Dark Magician, I think that would be fine. Yeah. If Fusion Destiny said for the whole turn you can only summon hero monsters, I think it would be fine, but it doesn't say that. Yeah. So yeah, generic boss monsters. I'd say this is part one. I'd say that's the main problem with Yugioh that leads to these other issues for sure. Yeah, I think, and unfortunately, I don't see it changing. Konami likes this, the fact that they just released a branded engine, even though there's more restrictions on the branded engine, which I like. It for the most part locks you into fusions, which I think is good. I don't see it changing with Therions and stuff coming out. Therions and Splites tell me that Konami is enjoying this kind of less archetypal, more engine-focused Yu-Gi-Oh! And also, guys, you guys might like it more. Tell me if you like it more. If you like it more, that's also fine. It's also fine if this is the kind of Yu-Gi-Oh! You like. However, I don't like it, and I do think it's a problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! So yeah, thank you all for watching. Part 2 will be out soon, talking about splashable engines. But yeah, in the meantime, have a good day, guys. Peace.